welcome the morning. Your soul is as free as the air. The flowers are all laughing to welcome the morning. Your soul is as free as the air. Leave home in the sunshine, dance through a meadow, or sit by a stream and just be. The lilt of the water will gather your worries and carry them down to the sea. The lilt of the water will gather your worries and carry them down to the sea. Men hunger for freedom, but don't see their dungeon is only the thought that they're bound. Desires are the shackles, the hope that tomorrow the doorway to joy will be found. Desires are their shackles, the hope that tomorrow the doorway to joy will be found. There's joy all around us, why wait till tomorrow? We've only this moment to live. A heaven within us is ours for the finding, a freedom no riches can give. A heaven within us is ours for the finding, a freedom no riches can give. There's joy in the heavens, a smile on the mountains, and melody sings everywhere. The flowers are all laughing to welcome the morning. Your soul is as free as the air. The flowers are all laughing to welcome the morning. Your soul is as free as the air. The flowers are all laughing to welcome the morning. Your soul is as free as the air. That song was composed by Swami Kriyananda when he was stuck in traffic in the rain in San Francisco. Well, I may not be able to control the weather outside, but I can control the weather inside. That song came out nice. Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach my heart to impart everywhere your delight. Sing of moonrays on the rain, sing that love's not in vain. Every grief, every wrong has its ending in song. Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach all men how to spin clouds of blue into light. Without silence, what is song? Without night, where is dawn? Were it not for men's woes, who would smile at our rose? Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Let each tone silence grow, earth and heaven unite. Morning laughter, evening tears, snow and blossoms all fade. Joy must sing in the night to face change unafraid. Nightingale, nightingale, nightingale. Easy. sing along with us after we do this once or twice. Long I've called you my Lord, long I've called you. Many years I have longed for your sight. Bathed the darkness with tears of devotion, offered candles in prayer to your light. How much longer, friend, must I cry your name? I am yours, ever yours. Will you come? I think that's a little high for you to sing, so we're going to lower it a little bit. And we'll do it again. Long I've called you my Lord, long I've called you. Many years I have longed for your sight. Bathe the darkness Reveal thyself, 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 reveal thyself.
The theme that we're working with today is just essential keys to success. And we've talked about it. It's articulated in Keys to Success in meditation practice, but I think for it to be really maximally useful for people, we really have to broaden that theme, because even the desire to meditate requires a certain attitude toward life. And I think many of you are working on it on many levels, in which just meditation practice isn't the only question. Here, I'll take that in my hand. That's all right, thank you. So I think we have to sort of ask ourselves, what are we doing with our lives? Is it going as well as we want? And is there anything we can do to make it better? And meditation is a tool, and like all tools, it sits there unless you use it. But the more skillfully you know how to use it, the more effective it'll be for you. One of the most important sort of things that we have to establish before we even can have a serious conversation about meditation is why we would want to meditate. And why we would want to meditate has a lot to do with sort of what do we perceive our lives to be about, where are we standing in our lives, and what's important to us. The lives that we all live these days, New Zealand is not quite as frantic as America, but nonetheless, all of us find ourselves just caught up in the everyday flow of life. And we all have to earn a living. Many of us are taking care of children or raising a family or have property that we have to work with. We have animals. We have our own inner demons that we're always working with, which is the inner war that we always are on. The Bhagavad Gita, which is the classic scripture of India, and was one of the primary missions of Yogananda, was to interpret that scripture. It's set on a battlefield. And interestingly, most of the great epics of all of religion and all of history are all set on battlefields. When women were first asserting themselves some decades ago, they accused society as a whole of being male-driven and interpreted many things in wrong ways, just saying that they were the symptoms of a patriarchal society and so on. And this all-pervasive theme of war in so many scriptural and literary things is one of the things that people, women, became upset about. But the fact of the matter is, the reason that so many of these enduring mythologies are all about war has nothing to do with man's inhumanity to man, which is an unfortunate fact of life, but it has much more to do with what it feels like to be a human being. And very rarely do we find ourselves or anyone just effortlessly able to put all our energy in one direction and not find that within ourselves the enemy's already in the tent, so to speak. That no matter how much we want to go this direction, a whole part of us always wants to go in the opposite direction. The whole Bhagavad Gita, as I was starting to say, is set on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. And it is historical. There was, in fact, a conflict between two clans who were cousins, who had a common grandfather, and one group had a right to the kingdom, and the other wanted to take that right away from them. And it did, in fact, go to war, and the characters were many of them as they are presented in that epic. But the real battle of Kurukshetra, which was the name of the field where it took place, was not really on the land where you can actually still go and see it. The battle of Kurukshetra is the battle within ourselves. And the war between cousins with the common ancestor is who we are, which is, on one side, there is that understanding within ourselves, it's either a realization or an aspiration, that there is this light and this goodness, which is who I really am. Kindness, love, connectedness to the world around me, a true friend, all of those realities. And then the other side of us is just filled with the thought that don't be a fool. Don't be generous. Think about yourself. What about all the abuse that's been done to you? How can you possibly be free and loving, giving what you've been through? Keep for yourself what is yours. There's a lot of jokes about devil quoting scripture in the Festival of Light, which many of you witnessed yesterday. There's a line in there, there's an allegory about a little bird, and that little bird represents the soul and its journey. And the bird gets confused, and it says, it's a rhetorical question, it asks itself, what else is wisdom except to keep what is mine for myself? Now in the allegory, that is not the right question and not the right answer. But every time one wants to justify one's own selfishness, we always say, well, what else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? And I watched a little child once. You know, sometimes we get an exaggerated romantic idea of how pure little children are. So this little 2 or 3-year-old child was sitting on the lap of its mother, and there's a chant that we sing, Lord, I am thine, I am thine, I am thine. And she was sitting there charming us all. Lord, I am thine, I am thine. And then she saw her bottle and she said, Lord, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine. And it's just about that easy, isn't it? That we just shift from one to the other because we're always in this conflict. And it's very important on the spiritual path right from the very start, and that's why the epics and the scriptures are so often a war, for us to realize that this really is going to be a battle. It isn't, even though in a paradoxical way, this is our true nature, and where we're trying to get is into this state of effortless ease, but from here to there, there's a lot of karma. And it's just as simple as that. And karma is ideas that we had at one point that served us, but now no longer serve us. Yesterday I mentioned about spiritual growth being directional, and that being such an important point. This is how we have to always understand our spiritual life. I'm standing here, the light is over there. And where I am standing now determines for me what my own next step is. And what my own next step may be may have nothing to do with anyone else's next step, because it just depends on where I am in relation to center. When I was 18 years old, 19 years old, I realized that I had a very accommodating nature, but the central motivation of my accommodating nature was not really goodness. It was actually fear. I mean, many of you will recognize it. It's a common psychological thought. Fear of conflict, fear of standing up for myself, fear of being thought of various things. I was pretty much a strong, independent person, but it was still under there. In our family, we never openly conflicted, or rarely openly conflicted. My mother was more outspoken, but my father really had an absolute aversion to conflict. And so I learned to just be accommodating because it wasn't in our system. But I realized that I had grown into independence and I was living on my own by that point. But that inclination to accommodate was still there. But on the spiritual path, you have to understand, it's not what you're showing to the world, it's what your heart actually is. And there's a divine principle, which is an important one, and it's put this way: God reads the heart. And that's meant as a comforting thought, which is no matter how things turn out, Divine Mother reads your intentions, and she knows your own goodness. But what that also means is you can't fool the divine. And you really can't fool yourself. You just think you are. And you certainly can't fool your friends because they always read right through you. You just think you are. But what it is, it depends on what is really motivating us. What is our essential vibration? So I was 19 and I realized that a deep part of my essential vibration was not harmony, but actually fear. And so my next step was to overcome that fear. And the idea of being harmonious was actually not that important. What was more important was for me to overcome the fear. And I was living in New York City, which is a great place to overcome fear of conflict. New Yorkers are famous throughout the world for their rather brash, straightforward way of being. So I was able to be in New York City a way that would have been appalling in California, where I come from, but was considered just completely ordinary. But it was an odd thing for me to realize, but an important lesson I've never forgotten, that what I needed to become was authentically myself. And I needed to be whoever and whatever I am. Because we can't build anything if we don't have an actual foundation. Sister Gyanamata, who was the most advanced woman disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda, she was a fully realized being. She had a principle that I always really liked. And she said, speaking in the same way, about the necessity to start your spiritual life from a genuine foundation. And she said, what you need to find is you need to find that point in terms of your own personal expansion, however you define that, in which you have complete confidence. And what that means is you can read wonderful things in many books and be extremely inspired by what the great saints say and what the scriptures say. But between what you can say and even be fascinated with intellectually and even have an intuitive feeling that it might be true, and your point of unshakable faith, there may be a great difference. And it doesn't mean that we're not always pushing that point. But nonetheless, we need to find the point where there is no doubt in my mind of this truth. And people find it in different ways. I'll give you some examples. You know, some people have just this inner feeling, let's say, that God is real, that God exists. Or maybe one has had an experience, you know, a moment in time. Maybe it was at a point of crisis in your life. Maybe you were rescued in some way. Maybe it was in your great love for another person or for a newborn baby or something like that, where you have just, you know there's another dimension, and that other dimension is love. You may forget it all the time, but you can always, but you can always go back to that. For me, one of my unshakable points of faith was when I first met Swami Kriyananda. And I just saw him, and I understood by the grace of God, somehow what his consciousness was and what that could mean to me, meaning that this man can teach me. And whatever else has happened to me in my life, I've never doubted that. I've doubted myself, I've doubted my decisions, I've doubted thousands of things, but my point of unshakable faith is that I know that this man is true, and if I simply do not give up, that he will help me. Okay, now all of you have to think for yourself where you stand. It's very important in your spiritual life that you have some spot like that. And it doesn't matter how far back you have to go. Your point of unshakable faith may be simply, I sure hope there's something more than this. But whatever it is, so that no matter what else happens to you in your life, you always have a spot where you can stand. And if you build an edifice that's maybe a little bigger than you want it to be, you can come back to exactly what point it is. A friend of mine built a house when in the early years of Ananda Village, when everything was very haphazard and we were very unregulated. And there was a steep hillside, and he was building on that hillside. And he put up this little house, and it was very like a little cabin, really. It wasn't a whole house at all. It was just a small cabin. And he made it nicer and nicer in the inside. And then he actually got electricity, and he moved a refrigerator in and everything like that. And just when it was completely set, it fell down the hill. Because, and he freely admitted it, he was so much more concerned about what it looked like on the inside that he never actually made the foundation right. And he was honest enough to say it was a perfect image of his entire spiritual life. And it was a great lesson to lose it, because he realized he'd never sunk his roots deep enough, because he'd never had the courage to be honest enough. He was always trying to look better than he was. I mean, to whom are we trying to look better? It's the joke, you see, because the divine is right inside of us. We never fool God. And what's so sweet about it, and this is one of those points of unshakable faith, if you can find it, is that we're just fine the way we are. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean we're just fine in the sense that we have no place to go from here. From the point of view of unshaken happiness, we might be absolutely lousy. But we're just fine because this is where we are. You know? And there's a lot of karma behind us. I'm extremely impressed with how persistent a broken heart is. I'm just very, very impressed by it. I used to toss these things off much more lightly when I was younger. I mean, toss them off intellectually. But the longer I live, the more I really appreciate that we have to be very gentle to ourselves. Broken hearts, not even just in this lifetime. I've had a few difficult karmas to work through in a spiritual family as old as the one that we're all part of. As Swami Kriyananda put it, we've been a lot of things to each other. You know, we've been sweet and loving, and we've also been mortal enemies. And so sometimes your friendships are hard won. There's a few people who are close in my life where the friendship is hard won. There's a lot from the past. And I've had some pretty seriously real intuitions about some of those difficulties. And one in particular where I definitely provoked from my present friends the stern actions they had to take against me in previous incarnations. You know, these things get really complicated. But at the same time, I felt really mistreated. I mean, I'm talking God knows how many incarnations ago. And I had to be honest enough to say to myself the other day, I want somebody to apologize to me for things that happened who knows when. But it's still in there. What Swami Kriyananda believes himself to have been, and he was, in fact, the son of William the Conqueror. Yogananda declared that in a previous incarnation he was William the Conqueror in England, the Duke of Normandy who crossed over and took possession of England. And it's very interesting because that whole historical moment actually set the tone for the founding of America and for everything that has happened since, and self-realization beginning in America. It's fascinating, but there's a book which we don't have, which is called Two Souls, Four Lives. Very interesting book about William and Henry. Well, one of the things that happened to Henry was Henry had a number of children outside of marriage, and then he had one legitimate heir. And his illegitimate children, just to defend his reputation, were conceived when he did not have a wife. When he had a wife, he only conceived this legitimate child. But in any case, he set up, you know, the succession in kingship is incredibly important, especially in those times, the 1100s. So he had set up very carefully, you know, this was going to be his heir. He had all the nobles, everybody had sworn allegiance. It was just all in place. And the whole court had gone over to Normandy for a time, and then they were going back across the channel to England. This is all historical fact. And all of the aristocrats were there, all of the royal people, and both generations were present. And the young people, including this designated heir, wanted to ride on one boat together, and then the other generation was on the other boat. And the younger generation, they started drinking wine on that boat, and they started sharing the wine with the crew. And the crew got drunk, the boat hit a rock, and the ship went down. And almost everyone was drowned. Meanwhile, the other generation goes across. Well, I think one person survived and made it across, delivered the message that the whole generation, including the designated heir, had been wiped out. I mean, now think about that. I was there, whether I was under the water, above the water, a drunken sailor, I'm not quite sure what part I played, but I was definitely part of that story. When I read this historically the first time, I literally was weeping. It was so painful. And I wrote Swamiji a note of condolence. Dear sir, I'm so sorry that, your son was killed. And because I just felt like, I don't know what I was apologizing for. He wrote back to me and said, I certainly appreciate the sentiment, but then he said, but you have to understand it was a long time ago. But it didn't feel long to me, because we have all of these unresolved issues. Just using that story, imagine if, what if I'd been responsible? What if I was the one passing around the wine and had drowned and it had been my fault? Just not that I'm trying to make it pitiful, but you understand. And people do evil things to us, and we do evil things ourselves. And all of those are part of the karma that we're working with right now. And the most challenging part of getting on the spiritual path and staying on the spiritual path is a calm acceptance of the reality of who I am and what I have to work through. We have this really weird idea that if we don't face it, somehow it will be solved. It's a strange idea in this respect, which is facing it seems so difficult that we imagine that if I don't face it, somehow it will be resolved. But it's going to simply be faced eventually. There's this weird thing about time, which is that it's always now. Have you noticed that? It's just always now. There is no actual then. Because when you get to then, it's now. Right? And even when it was back then, whatever was unresolved is still now. And this is the battle. This is why it's always a war. Because the two parts of us have to make this resolution, and these are the two parts. I am justified in my suffering because, or everything happens in divine order, and no matter how challenging it is, God is taking me where I want to go, because on the other side of this there is freedom. And the most important thing we have to work with to stay on the spiritual path is to just very deeply accept, and this is the only way to put it, that there is no alternative. And that our perseverance is really a matter of life and death. Life and death in the sense that how much longer do I want to suffer? And do I have the courage to just, what we're really talking about is balancing the karma, just paying it off, whatever it is. Nothing happens to us out of divine order, and believe me, that is a tough one, because really tough things happen to us. And to try to think that somehow this is all in order, that's why we run away. And we run away life after life after life, until you reach a point, and this has been the struggle of my own life too, everyone's life. It's like, I either face it now or I face it now. And I might as well face it now. There was in our community, because we are very involved with each other, things happen. And there was a marriage that broke up because the man involved really wanted to be with a different woman. And he was very noble in that cycle of time. So when finally the shift came, Swami Kriyananda and everyone felt that he'd done his best. As Swami puts it, Swami is very understanding. He said, quote, "You cannot always control the feelings of the heart. He did not favor the shift, but he understood it. You understand the difference there. The day after that the marriage broke up, Swami Kriyananda invited all three, both women and the husband, to come to dinner at his house. He had the women cook dinner together because we were all friends. We all knew each other for years. When he suggested he was going to invite everyone over to dinner, I said, "Swamiji, do you understand what happened yesterday?" He said, "Of course." But this was his answer, which none of us have ever forgotten. They're going to have to face it sooner or later. He said, "Why wait to a future incarnation when they don't remember why they hate each other?" He said, and it wasn't the end of the karma by any means. But the woman who'd been left said later, she said she was able to rise to it in the moment. And having remembered that she was able to rise to it, it gave her the strength to eventually come to where she needed to be. Now, you only asked that of very great souls. Swami Kriyananda has only ever asked it of that one woman, because she is a great soul. Most people, it's too much to ask. But if we feel we've been mistreated, nobody understands us, well, we probably have been mistreated and probably nobody does understand it. But God understands it. Where are we going to look for our solutions? And so you succeed and you fail and you succeed and you fail. You have good days, you have bad days. I'm not talking about, don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about what people call denial. I'm not talking about not feeling what you actually feel and pasting some false affirmation on top of it. Very sincere devotees sit in front of their altars and weep their eyes out, weep their hearts out. A woman friend of mine who also faced a difficult romantic situation, very difficult, she was left with a young child. And she said her meditation, she would just sit in front of the altar and cry. That's all she did for many months. She would sit in front of her altar during her meditation time, but all she would do was cry. Then paradoxically, the man who had abandoned her was in India, and he was with a great saint, a woman saint who was alive then, named Anandamoyi Ma. And somehow or another, he had to explain to her the whole story of his life, and that he'd left his wife and baby back home, and he was never going back to them. And my friend was nowhere. She didn't know any of this was happening. But on that very day, she sat down and she actually meditated. And she said she never cried again. And she said she was having a full meditation before she realized that she wasn't crying anymore. And a month later, a mutual friend sent a note to her and said, on this day, this man was with this saint and he talked about your life. And that was the very day that it shifted for her. Now, will we all have such miracles? We all pray for such miracles, don't we? But see, these are the articles of faith that we have to hold, that in the end, everything is coming to us in order to give us the strength we need to really be who we're meant to be. Now, the best way to realize this is to be able to tune in to a reality other than the mundane. And this is where all the practices of spiritual life come. And meditation is one of the most powerful tools, but by no means the only one. But meditation is that effort simply to separate ourselves from this ongoing, never-ending drama of love and betrayal and disappointment and loss and abandonment and then brief fulfillment or deep fulfillment that ultimately ends, because everything ends as long as we're living in this ephemeral world. I asked my mother once, I said, what was the happiest time of your life? And her face lit up. Oh, when you children were small. And it was very sweet. But I realized, there's been a lot of years since your children were small, haven't there? And she had a good life, and she loved my father, and they had a good marriage, all those things. But I remember just looking at her and thinking about that. Wow. Another woman I know, she kept her pictures of her 3 children on the mantle, but it was like when they were 6, 7, and 8 years old, because that was when they belonged to her. And, it's nice to enjoy those things. But what meditation gives us, you see, is a perspective. I withdraw from all of that. Who am I when all of that is gone? Because sooner or later we're all going to die anyway. And what happens when we die is that it all goes away. And do we die gripping it and keeping it there? A woman friend of mine, the mother of a friend of mine, I seem to be talking about marriages breaking up right now, but I'll give one more and then I'll change the subject. She had 4 children, and her husband, she was a very difficult woman, and her husband grew tired of her and went away. And the children were then split. They weren't allowed to mention the father's name in the presence of the mother. And the mother was at the end of her life, and she was in this facility because she had to be taken care of, and she had all the pictures of all her children up on the wall. And my friend came to see her mother one day, and all of a sudden there was Dad's picture right in the middle of the whole thing. And she sort of looked at her mother like this, and her mother said, "Well, with all those kids, there had to be a father somewhere." But at the end of her life, she had really looked at it and realized, she just turned it. With all those wonderful children, there had to be a father somewhere. Now, who does that help? It helps your own heart, doesn't it? Because we always have to live inside our own consciousness. God gives and God takes away. And if we're wanting what God wants, and see, the way we get to this point is just looking at our own reality and seeing how many times that which seemed the worst turned out to have the best lesson for us. Not the easiest lesson or even the most welcome lesson, but in the end an absolutely essential lesson. So then we start really wanting to do those things that will change our consciousness, because what else will save us except to change our consciousness? So then your practice of meditation isn't just because I'm a little stressed or something like that. It's because it's the only way out. It's the only protection that we have against the resolution of the past and building the right flow of energy for the future. And now what meditation is about is the ability to forget yourself, to be conscious of a greater reality, and to sort of let go of this small identification. So we have all kinds of other practices that go along with, the general practice, and one of them is simply having a selfless attitude toward our own life. In other words, you can't just sit down suddenly on your meditation cushion when all you've been doing all day long is thinking about yourself. There's a song that Swami wrote, the chorus of which is I, my, me, mine. And I don't think we can sing it, I don't know if we can sing it as a solo or not, but we often sing it as a group, and you have all these different voices in harmony and cacophony, everybody singing I, my, me, mine, and it sometimes helps to make fun of these things. But if we're spending our whole life just calculating our own position. I was 18 when I first encountered the teachings of self-realization, and I read a book by Swami Vivekananda, who's a very great sage, and he said, "Don't think about yourself and you'll be happy." And at the age of 18 I thought, well, what else is there to think about? I mean, I was a generous, relatively happy person, but it was just a fact. In all circumstances, I constantly calculated my own advantage. And my advantage mostly was what would be the most fun for me. I wasn't selfishly trying to take advantage, but what would be the most fun for me? What would I enjoy the most? I carried that long into my life in the ashram. I was still always calculating what would I enjoy the most. But more than that, it was fascinating to me to realize that no matter what happened, my thought always swung back to myself. And I didn't even know how to begin to break it. Now, there's a very wonderful spiritual practice that I only learned later. The practice is called japa. Japa means the repetition of the name of the divine, or the repetition of a prayer, or the repetition of an affirmation. Because a lot of what we're doing, even in our meditations, we're just trying to break a habit. There's a habit that the mind has just tended to just keep going back to, what about me? What about me? There's the story of Charlotte's Web, you know, the beautiful story about the pig. And I guess it's the rat. And the rat says to the pig, "What's in it for me, Charlotte?" And that's just sort of his question. They propose that this rat be helpful, and he says, "What's in it for me, Charlotte?" Like that. In the course of Ananda, there's many things that have just become very meaningful, and that's one of them. What's in it for me, Charlotte, is the way we make fun of ourselves. I'm always trying to calculate my position. Now, once again, it's very important to understand this isn't a question of pretending that you don't have selfish feelings. This is a question of deciding where you want to put your energy. And so one of the fundamental practices is if you can just get your mind to think about something else, and I've used this to great effect because my mind is very forceful, and when it gets a hold of an idea, it has to be pried away from it. And that's where affirmations and mantras and prayers, just japa, just the repetition of. I had a period of time when I was trying to do something that I felt very underconfident in doing, and it was a constant battle for me to feel that I was going to be capable. So when you have an affirmation or something like this, you have to make sure that it connects somewhere with your actual reality. And this is where healthy psychology and spiritual life really match. You know, that's why, and sometimes people make grave mistakes and just simply try to be more spiritual than you are. And it doesn't really serve you. But in my, in my effort to give myself confidence, I wasn't able to say, you know, God's power is, I am one with the great infinite and everything I do is a perfect expression of God's will. It's just like, the more I would say that, the more I would say, no, not likely. If you have an affirmation that's bigger, that's too big for you, it actually weakens you. Because every time you say it, your subconscious mind rebels against it. And I see people practicing affirmations that I just know they don't work. Everything is love and all resolves into great harmony. And the more the person says it, the more you say to yourself, not really, not in my life, certainly. You're not starting from your point of unshakable faith. You see, you have to start from your point of unshakable faith. So the affirmation that I found was, I know God's power is limitless. That was the first line. And for me, that is, I do have, by the grace of God, I believe in that greater reality. I don't have to persuade myself. I've been doing this a long time, and I know it's there. I don't always connect to it properly, but I never doubt that it's its fault. I know it's mine. I know God's power is limitless. Second phrase I used was, and as I am made in His image. And that also for me is an article of unshakable faith. I recognize that even though I am trapped in my ego self, I really know that that's not me. I know God's power is limitless, and as I am made in His image. And then came the dicey part. I too have the strength to overcome all obstacles. And that was the part I had to push. But I was trapped by the first two phrases because it inevitably followed that it was true. And so my everyday battle was just to say that. And I would simply, and it sounds so simple, it's not easy, but it's very simple. Whenever the contrary thoughts would come, I would substitute this one. Just like that. You know, at the present, my practice is simpler. There's a beautiful chant, God, Christ, Guru. And when my mind wanders from where I want it to be, I just, God, Christ, Guru, God, Christ, Guru, God, Christ, Guru, God, Christ, Guru. I'm not working on anything in particular now, it's just, don't go elsewhere. Just stay there. And you bring this into your meditation practice when all of those forces that are trying to tell you that you really are not going to be able to do this come. And you use it for the rest of your day so that by the time you sit down to meditate, you'll already be leaning in the direction that you're trying to go. Now, I'm going to give us a little tea break. Let's take a little 10 minutes and have a little bit of tea and coffee, and then we'll come back and start with questions.
So we're going to do the solo version of the choir song that Asha referred to, just for fun. A sailor from England remarked to a foe, "The reason we win is we pray ere we go. But we pray as well, and just look at our dead. Ah, but we pray in English," the Englishman said. I, my, me, mine, 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 I, my, me, mine. And if you want, you can sing what I just sang throughout the rest of the song. I had a little box when my Lord made me, and in that little box I did put a tree, a pony, a teddy bear, a bright green sled, everything around me that my eyes did see. How can a little box ever hold a sled? A pony and a tree puzzles your poor head. It can't, my friend, but in a tiny baby's mind, this mighty world becomes a little box instead. Well, as I grew older, my box grew too, held airplanes and ships and a birch canoe, and school books, a foreign trip, and college proms, good times and friends aplenty, yes, and also you. But somehow in this box would only fit one school, one family, one country, and one social rule, and certainly one church for only my way's right, and anyone with other ways is just a fool. Well, so I used to think, but now I must confess, at judging fools I wasn't any great success. Truth somehow lived without me, though I called it mine. What box could hold the world? It's just preposterous.
I'd like to stop and ask for questions before I go any further, or directions if you have something that you would like me to focus on for the next half hour. Do I have any questions in the room today? You all were great the other day at asking questions. So I have this, I hope not a naive confidence that you now will. Any hope, any thoughts or comments that anyone would like to make before we go forward? Yes, Matthew.
I always struggled to, I went to lots of different schools when I was younger, and just given obviously a certain perspective of of religion and God when I was about, I don't know, 6.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to a Catholic school over at Warrell, which is on the east coast of New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got quite a lot of stuff into me without me realising, and how much effect it had on me. But just the whole, one of the things is I'm made as I am made in this image.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and I had this image of God being this old fella.
Yeah, and why would you be made like him?
Why is anyone made in the same image as this old fella?
Uh-huh.
And it's like, just...
This one isn't yours. I only wrote it on the board because someone asked me to. So this one isn't yours because
I know that, but it's just
yeah.
saying as I've had that, the
Yeah.
words, that terminology has been given to us, and it's like, it confused me, I didn't understand.
Well, that's why you have to keep backing up until you find the spot where you can really stand. No, incalculable damage has been done to spirituality by religion. It's just a fact, because spirituality has to grow out of your own heart, and religion can be, spirituality and religion can come together, but too often they're just quite separated, and even the whole word God has just become such a mess. I'm going to there's a word in Sanskrit which is Sat Chit Ananda. In English, the word God has absolutely no specific meaning. When I say the word God and you say the word God, we're thinking of something completely different, because I just came from a different place now, than you have with it. And the word God in English only has meaning insofar as your specific religious training gives it meaning, if you think about it. It's just inherently, there's no meaning to that word. So that's why people become atheists, and that's why they become very upset about the word God. And much of the time when I meet people who say they don't believe in God, I more or less agree with them in that I don't believe in that God either. And probably if that was the only image presented to me, I would feel just exactly like you, because it's perfectly valid. It doesn't work, and there's no space for it. In the Sanskrit language, which is a specific language for talking about consciousness, English is not a language for talking about consciousness. I mean, English-speaking people are interested in politics and social and material, and it's just not. It's not our orientation. We're the people who've conquered the material world. The origin of Sanskrit, which of course is ancient now, was for expressing the inner world, subtle states of consciousness. Much of what we have to use a few Sanskrit words like karma and chakras and others, because there is no English equivalent, because English-speaking people didn't make up a word for it. Sat Chit Ananda is a word that specifically translates into God in English, but it actually means something. Sat means eternal, and Chid means, actually the word is feeling, but in other words, it's an awareness. I'll use the word awareness as a better word. So it's eternal awareness, which is another way of saying immortality, and the word Ananda means bliss. So what this means is, this is the word God, it means an eternal awareness of bliss. Now, who would not want to believe in that? And who would, you may not believe in it because you may be persuaded that there's no eternity and there's no bliss. But at least when you say Sat Chit Ananda, nobody's going to argue with it being a desirable reality. And the metaphysics of self-realization is that everything emanates from Sat Chit Ananda, and everything goes back into Sat Chit Ananda. And when we're sitting to meditate, what we are getting back in touch with is that fundamental Sat Chit Ananda, which is ourself. And so when you experience it, it's just so self-evident. And everybody touches it every once in a while. Maybe out in nature, as I was saying, it may be with people you love, it may be with animals. You just suddenly are conscious of the fact that there's just something else that's going on and that I'm an integral part of it. And God becomes a very comfortable word after a while, but this is what you're thinking. And then the His, Her, Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, all of that, you lose all of the anthropomorphic stuff. And His just simply becomes the impersonal. See, the reason you use pronouns like that is because when you actually begin to experience this Sat Chit Ananda, wherever it comes to you, it's conscious. It's not an abstraction. And you have an active relationship with it. It's personal, is the word I want to use.
You feel it.
Yeah, you feel it yourself. And you recognize that something or someone, it's relating to you. It's not just sitting there while you look at it. It's actually part of you. And so him and her are the only words we have to describe that which is personal. But you understand that there is no Divine Mother in a little apron cooking Heavenly Father his porridge in the morning. It was just this ludicrous, but everything that Mother represents is the opening point that you go through. Everything that Father represents is the opening point that you go through. And it's just basically you pull the image close enough so that you have some way to take it. When Kavita was leading the meditation this morning, and she said, find something that brings out of you a feeling of love. And then she used the phrase, forget the backstory and just stay with the feeling. And it's not really that, well, Swami Kriyananda said when he first, at the age of 22, became a disciple of Yogananda in his ashram, and Yogananda would speak to him about Divine Mother, and he couldn't even begin to imagine. And then he thought of his godmother, who was a very sweet and lovely person, and he thought about her very sweet smile. And when he would think of Divine Mother, he would think of her sweet smile. And he said he knew that she wasn't the personification of Divine Mother, but it gave him a way of feeling the vibration. And then once he got to the door of it, with the right vibration, then he was able to move through it. Because what we also have to do, these are the essentials for success in meditation, it has to become personally meaningful to you. Yesterday, many of you were here, but not all of you, I was saying truth can be what you long for. But truth is a very high ideal with a tremendous amount of power. You don't have to be with the word, the kind of devotee that's all about Divine Mother and Heavenly Father. You can be just completely enthralled with cosmic truth. But even truth, it's the eternal awareness of the joy it gives you. And whatever doorway takes you through is the doorway that you want. Because all of them are inadequate. They're just ways of being able to kind of hint at this. Even the most odd symbols, when they're a true revelation, really represent something. I've traveled in India a fair amount over the years, and for many years I was part of leading some pilgrimage trips to India, and we often went in October, and there was the festival of the goddess Kali. The goddess Kali is the wild-haired one. Sometimes people talk about her as Mother Nature. Long black hair, she wears a garland of skulls. She has a bloody saber in one hand, and then the other hand is put out in blessing like this, and she's dancing on the prostrate form of her husband, and she has this red tongue that lolls out. I mean, yeah, it's pretty grim. It's not at all what you would just think of as Divine Mother cooking porridge for Heavenly Father. It's way outside of that. And we were in Calcutta at this particular time, and all the neighborhood associations during these festival times, they often make little altars, somewhere in the neighborhood, and they all get together and they'll get a beautiful big image, and the priests will conduct worship. It's really quite lovely because it's a much more spiritually oriented country. And so every 6 blocks or so, you would come to one of these being set up, and we were walking through. And I have I could be fairly philosophical about the symbolism and all these different things, but she didn't really attract me all that much. And we were walking in a group, and as often happens, things get very crowded there, and somehow the crowd was pushing me a little bit, and I didn't realize, but I was gradually backing up toward one of these altars. And then I turned around, and one of these Kali images was about right here. And I just looked at this thing, and I said to myself, I said to her actually, what is this? What is this? Who are you? And it was actually very interesting to me because I understand the process of how spirituality develops and religious traditions develop. I don't have it's not mysterious to me. And what I realized just looking at her, first of all, I thought, life feels a lot like that, doesn't it? Sometimes, doesn't it? Just wild and out of control, and you're being cut to pieces and blessed at the same time. And, there's just all of this. I mean, it was like, this was not an unrealistic picture of what life is like. And I realized that some great sage at some point had a revelation, and they had a revelation of this dimension of reality, and they translated it into an image. And it's not really that God looks like that, but if you kind of feel all of the different aspects of that, and Swami Kriyananda has written it up in a book called The Hindu Way of Awakening, but if you can use that as the doorway, then you can walk through it and find something on the other side. And then when you're comfortable with it, you can enjoy the symbol after that, because you understand where it's taking you. So even in our own lives, this is again, I'm going to go back to what I was saying. You have to be very, very personal about this. And you have to just pick and choose among all the possibilities that are there, those things that work for you. And you need to make in your own home, if you're serious about your spiritual practice, you need to make in your home, you need to put in front of you those things that are going to help you. Those affirmations that will help you, those images that will help you. We're very fortunate to have photographs of great saints, and nowadays there's many more or less current saints and great masters whose pictures you can actually see, whose eyes you can look into and actually feel the consciousness that they have. And you're not worshiping per se, but what you're asking is, take me where you are. Because that's the only reason they're there. And then that's why even all these centuries later, people who love Jesus can go into very high states of spirituality, because these are ever-living masters and they'll take you there. They can't do it for you. But if you're climbing a mountain and you don't know the way up, it certainly helps to have somebody walking with you who knows the way up, doesn't it? And that's really exactly what you're doing. And one of the things that really empowers your meditation and undoubtedly helps you to succeed is to recognize your need for help and then be willing to receive it and not become stubborn with, I don't like this, I don't want that. Swami Kriyananda, let me think how to say this. It was very interesting. When Swami Kriyananda met Yogananda, he read Autobiography of a Yogi, and within a week he was kneeling in front of Yogananda. The first words he said to him, I want to be your disciple. Now bear in mind, Swami was a very strong-minded, independent young man, and he never imagined he would ever say those words to anyone. And so, but he had the humility to realize that it was an appropriate thing to do. And he described it like this. He said, first of all, the reason he never imagined becoming a disciple was that he never imagined that there was anybody who could teach him. That's a pretty obvious thing. I'm never going to become a disciple because there's nobody who's wise enough for me to want to be their disciple. And when he saw Autobiography of a Yogi in a bookstore in New York, he had an immediate relationship with that picture. Although, as he tells the story, he didn't buy the book right away, because he opened it and it says, dedicated to an American saint, Luther Burbank. And Swami Kriyananda thought, oh, there can't be such a thing as an American saint. America is just a materialistic place. And he closed the book and put it back on the shelf. He allowed his prejudice and his narrow-mindedness to negate the intuitive recognition he felt for the picture. So he walked away. But then a few days later, he was in New York City again, and he thought about the book, and he felt an attraction to go buy it. But then he thought, oh no, you own too many books, you're too intellectual, this is not the right thing to do, I'm not going to buy any more books. And then he started to go in one direction, and he actually found that he had been turned and was heading toward the bookstore. It's just like a force actually turned him around. And at that point, he surrendered everything. And he just realized that the face on that book is calling me. So he went and he bought the book, and in just a few days, he just read the whole thing and felt himself to be in contact with a power that he had never imagined existed. And he had the openness and the humility to let go. And he then immediately got on a bus from New York City to Los Angeles, and days later he was kneeling in front of Yogananda asking to be his disciple. So that was one part of it. The other part of it was, and I found that this very touching, Swami said he felt that the search for truth was so personal that he didn't understand how anyone could help another person with that. You know, it was a matter, in other words, you see, it was a matter of great integrity that he was resisting. But once again, he'd also begun to discover, and this is what we all have to discover, golly, it's not working. It sounds good, but it's not working. I'm not making progress myself. And that made him suddenly realize that maybe there was a limit. And then when the opportunity came, he simply took it. And then he operated, and this was very interesting, he operated on exactly what I'm talking about, which is that point of unshakable faith. Everything that he was learning from Yogananda was, to use the common phrase, just blew his mind. He had never even heard the word guru. This is 1948. Guru, karma, everything. It was completely foreign to him. The only thing he knew was that he had an absolute faith in Yogananda. There was just no question that he had absolute faith. And so people in the ashram were telling him all kinds of things, and that it was kind of a unfocused time, so people had lots of other opinions. But no matter how far out the idea, he would ask one question: is that what Yogananda says? And if it wasn't, if the source wasn't Yogananda, he just would reject it. But no matter how bizarre and difficult it was for him to accept, if Yogananda said it, he at least couldn't reject it. Because he had a point of unshakable faith, which is, this man is true and will tell me the truth. And even if I don't understand it or know what to do with it. So this is where, you know, this is, of course, was a unique story. But with all of us, you know, where has Spirit touched me? Where has Satchidananda intruded itself on my life? And let me measure everything against that. But then have the humility and the courage to figure that, what do I know? You know, I mean, our what we know now has served us, and this is another part of how our meditation becomes successful, and this is very tricky, which is, the world as a whole does not support this inner reality as a way of life. I mean, all of you know that. I don't have to tell you. You live and work, and you do not live in ashrams. You know, you live and work in all sorts of places, and everybody has all kinds of ideas. New Zealand is less nutty than where I live in terms of just the intensity of the materialistic commitment. The intensity of the materialistic commitment where I live is Olympian. It's really quite impressive. And that's one of the reasons I like being here. It's sort of like, But nonetheless, the concept of reality is completely external. This is not a deeply mystical place. It's a psychically sensitive place, but there's some here. There's a lot that's good here. I like it here. But nonetheless, the basic view of life is still materialistic. So for any one of you, to have had the individual integrity and creativity to imagine another alternative, you have to have had a certain amount of strength within yourself to stand aside from the mass hypnosis. And that's very important. You have to have that kind of integrity to get on the spiritual path in this particular age on the planet. There's planets that are much more advanced where everything is spiritual. There's been ages on this planet where everything was spiritual. We're just not in one right now. So that confidence in your unique perception has been essential to get you to this point. And part of the art now on the spiritual path is to know when to trust it and when to surrender it. And to be able to tell the difference between what I have always thought was true and what I am now learning is true. I used to play this with Swami Kriyananda because I was very young, very strong-minded, stupidly strong-minded, I will say now. And he was very powerful in many of the things he said. Over many years, essentially I've come to accept everything he said, but I couldn't accept it all at the beginning. but I couldn't reject it either. So I played a game with myself, which was I put it on the shelf. And I just had this little mental storage spot where I put the things that he said that I couldn't reject, but I couldn't accept. And that way I kept both my discipleship and my integrity. And that's a very fine art. But then every so often I would open that box and see what they look to me like to me now. Gradually I've opened all those boxes and I've accepted all of those things because I grew. But if I had rejected them, I would have simply condemned myself to the level of understanding that I had in that moment. And speaking for myself, it was not working for me. You know, everything was okay. But I had another point of intuitive conviction, was that okay was not good enough. And you know, there was this, born of past lives really. I said to Swamiji once, you know, sir, I have this tremendous desire not to suffer. Just this intense desire to be happy, this tremendous desire not to suffer. And I was very fortunate in my birth and raising. I never suffered. I mean, everything went fine for me. It was also because I had a disciplined mind. But also I wasn't challenged. I said, so it's not like I had this experience to contrast with, but just I was born. And he just smiled at me and he said, past lives. Oh yeah, that's right. So think about it. If you died in some of the ways I was talking about, something you die with enormously unresolved issues, of course you're just going to be born right where you stopped. And you're going to have figured out, wow, this really didn't work. I put all my eggs in this particular basket and that basket just turned over and all those eggs broke. So you'll be just a little more cautious, won't you, the next time? Gee, maybe there's another way to do this. That didn't work so well. Because it's a continuing story. You know, we have to go through all that business of being a baby again. And as everyone always says, you have to go to junior high again, which is really the worst, and go through your adolescence. That's why you don't want to reincarnate again. But nonetheless, your full consciousness and your full intelligence is in place. So again, we have to trust ourselves. And often we have to look back to when we were younger, before we got a little confused. What was important to me? Who was I? This is very important, yes.
How can I be sure that I'm learning the karmic lessons that I need to learn in this lifetime? Is it to do with trust and intuition?
Well, you can't be sure. You can only be sure that you're trying. I mean, I myself at this point, I don't understand much. I don't understand much about my own destiny is what I mean. But I have made it very, very simple. I'm either thinking of God and giving to others, or I'm worried about myself. And the details have become really pretty unimportant to me. The details intrude themselves. The details have a nasty habit of intruding themselves. But in the end, they don't matter. Because the only thing you're trying to be, and I want to say this, how to say this, you're trying to be free. You're just trying to free yourself from the power of the ephemeral world, which is birth, death, disappointment, betrayal, success, everything. Just the power of the ephemeral world to define your state of joy. And you want to go to Satchidananda. And so it's just a battle between those two things. Swami Kriyananda said something extremely important once. Because this world is so incredibly complicated, just amazingly complicated, and it just goes to permutation after permutation. And we imagine, because God, Satchidananda, however you want to call it, is the maker of this, that he must be the most complicated of all. But in fact, what makes this world complicated is that it's always oscillating. This was wonderful and started out beautiful, and then it's day, and then it's night, it's youth, and then it's old age, it's life, and then it's death, it's health, and then it's sickness, it's wealth, and then it's poverty. Isn't that that's the problem, isn't it? It's always oscillating. And the metaphysical explanation of this whole creation is that the one power of spirit vibrated and makes this duality. But the closer we get to the source, the more singular it becomes. It's either we are aware of this eternal bliss, or something in our karmic condition has persuaded us that now I am justified in being unhappy. And what Swami, and you know, as I said, those things are very persuasive. I used to be much more cavalier about the power of heartbreak. Now I'm not. But the closer you get to the center, the simpler it becomes, because all the oscillations stop. And so the more deeply in our spiritual practice we can understand that if I am suffering, it's because somehow I haven't understood. Now that doesn't mean you stop suffering. That just means that you stop rebelling against it. And you just start saying, okay, Lord, wherever you're going to take me. Swami Kriyananda would often say, it doesn't matter whether you're suffering or not. The only thing that matters is that you persevere in your faith, that if I just don't quit, it'll take me where I need to go. These are long cycles. I say to myself, as I said to you all yesterday, I'm a sincere spiritual person. This is what's happening to me. This must be what happens to sincere spiritual persons. And if I can't overcome the misery-producing circumstances of my life, as Swami says, I can at least do my best to mentally resist being completely overwhelmed by them. And if I'm completely overwhelmed by them, I will call that my meditation until it stops. But then after it's over, you come back. We do the Festival of Light every Sunday in the Ananda world. We performed it yesterday. We'll do it Sundays again. There's a story in there about the little bird. He's analogous. And the bird goes through this stage of his life, which is called the revolt, which is, I want it to be different. There was a little 3-year-old boy in our community, very powerful child, incredibly powerful child. And he was living in this 5-story mansion that we had all rented as a group house in San Francisco. And the house had this huge staircase up the middle, and the acoustics of the house were anything that happened on the staircase was heard in the house. 2 in the morning, one morning, this child was wide awake and bored. He climbed out of his little bed. He stood right in the middle of the staircase and he shouted to the whole house, I want it to be morning! Just like that. Woke up the entire house. Because he'd had it with night. He wanted it to be morning.
Let there be light.
Yeah, let there be light. But that's the stage of the revolt. I don't want to face this. I don't want to overcome it. I just want it to be different. I want the rules of this creation to be different than they are. I'm going to declare them. And how well is that working for you? I want other people to have different attitudes than they have. I want them to respond. I want to own the people in my life. I want them to conform to my ideas of things. I want my children to stay small forever. And that's the revolt. And the bird goes over it. The afternoon of the bird's life was like eons of our time, is how it's described. Even when the bird lost everything he had repeatedly, he kept declaring reality. Finally, he suffered enough. And the stage he entered was not the bliss stage, but the second stage is called the quest. And the quest is when you start saying, what the heck is going on here? You don't have the answers yet, but instead of saying, God, what are you doing to me? You say, God, what are you doing to me? And you don't know yet, but now it's crossed your mind that maybe there's something else going on. And nobody comes onto the spiritual path until they're at that point. And so that you would expect that you could master all your karma is simply naive. But that you could sincerely desire to understand how to do it and persevere until you succeed that's the battle. That's why it's always a war. But, and this is where we started, what choice do we have? Find a better choice. If you can find a better choice and persuade me, I'll grab it. But I've been thinking about this for a really long time, and I can't find a better one. So, any other questions, or shall we just go and have lunch? Yes, Marie. There you have it. Mm-hmm.
We can't get away from suffering.
Mm-mm.
We just stop resisting it,
Mm-hmm.
and we're heading in the right direction towards the light. We want to continue to God. Then, how do you have eternal awareness bliss with suffering?
We live on many dimensions at the same time. Even a great soul like Swami Kriyananda, and this was actually something I had to learn slowly with him. He felt things very, very deeply, much more deeply than many, because he could see the implications. For a number of years of my friendship with him, I didn't understand that you can be very God conscious, have great faith in God, and be very willing to do whatever has to be done. And you can have that level of faith and even surrender and even a certain kind of joy, and simultaneously be aware of the poignancy of this world. But when you know that God has a plan, Swami put it once so sweetly. He said, whenever he sees people suffering, he thinks, how much greater will be their sense of freedom when that suffering is finally dissolved by their union with God. So that's how he would see it. This is the part of the journey that is very challenging for the people who are in it, including me. But I know that everything in the end will resolve into bliss. And even if it hasn't yet, the knowledge that you're going to get there. I've joked about this because I've done a lot of travel. You're on a 36-hour journey to Paris. And the journey is very unpleasant, but in the end you're in Paris. And I think sometimes about our lives like that. It doesn't mean that we're not suffering, but knowing where we're going. Knowing that I will learn something from this. And when I learn it, I'll be so much more capable, not only of experiencing happiness myself, but of giving it to others. And even in the middle, you don't always know it. Now, I've seen this enough in my life. I had a 3-year cycle where I just failed at everything I did. And it was a very, very, very difficult time for me. But it was extremely spiritually rich, because it burned out of me a lot of qualities that I really needed to get rid of. And I wrote to Swami at the end. He said, except for the fact that, everything in my life is a shambles, this has been one of the most wonderful periods of my life, because I could see what I was learning. It didn't mean that I was happy, but I could see what I was learning, and I knew when I really had mastered those things, I would be able to give more and have more. So that's the war. Nobody enjoys being on the field and hacking away, but sometimes it's the only way to get there. A woman friend of mine died of cancer. She was not quite 50. Had a lovely family, a very well-to-do, beautiful home, a great sense of all of it. She lived much longer than the doctors expected, but the day actually, I just by intuition, the day the doctors told her they couldn't do anything more for her, I just stopped by to see her. So I ended up just coming into her house like an hour after this had happened. And she's gesturing to this beautiful home she lives in and the pictures of her children and her husband and all of that, and she's just weeping. First she said, I know this is going to sound silly, but I always thought I was going to get well. I mean, she had so much cancer, there was very little chance. It was the second round of it. She sort of ruefully said that. And then she just said, how can I leave all of this? And I said to her, there's a wall of fire now between where you are and where you're going. And there's no other route to where you're going. You are just going to have to walk through that wall of fire. But if you do, you will find something on the other side of it. And it was a wall of fire. I mean, it broke her heart and the heart of all her friends and family. But then I was with her when she died, when it was really, when she was in the last days, and it's hard for me to say this. She just looked at me and she said, "You were right." Just like that. And you could just see that this, she just understood, this is just one incarnation, there was a purpose behind this. It was a challenge to everything that I am, but I met it. And she just died blissfully. Just following the light, just going into the light. And with that confidence. Was it a tragedy that she died? You see how awkward it gets? You go through that yourself or you witness it, and then everything begins to shift. And you think the waves on the ocean don't matter so much. It's being in the depth of it. It doesn't mean that you don't feel it. It just means that the meaning of it becomes different because now it's a quest for something else. That's why the testimony of the masters is so important, because if Yogananda didn't write Autobiography of a Yogi and tell us what is possible, if Kriyananda hadn't lived and shown us what is possible, you would doubt. All right, I don't think we can go anywhere else but to lunch.